punctual?
We are punctual, and in fact, we are officially commencing. My name is Bruce Tatoris. It's my honor to moderate this first roundtable of TrineDay's The Valediction Roundtable series. Monthly roundtables, at least for the next 4 months, the title of which is Creating a Better World for Our Children, the Rise and Fall of Empires and the Narrative Creation Process. This is roundtable number 1, Afghanistan and Beyond, American Duplicity Since the 1970s. This is going to be about 1 hour, maybe a little longer, but we're gonna go for an hour. And Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould are a husband and wife authors of the brand new book called The Valediction, 3 Nights of Desmond, which is about America's manipulation of Afghanistan. And they inspired publisher Kris Millegan of TrineDay to create this roundtable series. And near and around Paul and Elizabeth's house, they're doing construction, road work, they're digging up something. They've been put on notice. At any minute, their power may go out. Hopefully we get through the roundtable before that happens.
Right.
But should that happen, we will pivot and accommodate appropriately. And I'm going to go around. There's 4 or 5 of us who are kind of panelists. First of which is Kris Millegan, the publisher of TrineDay, a small publishing house based in Oregon. And over the last 20 years, Kris has published about 120 books that the mainstream won't touch. And also with us are Paul and Liz, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, like I say, authors of The Valediction. And they acquired the first visas to enter Afghanistan in 1981. And then we're going to ask each of them to chat for a minute, give their basic approach and angle to this. Also with us is Dr. Jaweed Nawabi of the City University of New York, and the author S.K. Bain of many wonderful books, the most illustrious of which is Timeliness is the Most Dangerous Book in the World, 9/11 as Mass Ritual. And Kris, why don't you chat for a second about what's in your heart and your intentions approaching this roundtable, please?
Well, I'm a big fan of the trivium, which is basically the classical education. And one of the big parts of the trivium is something as the dialectic. And it's basically, if we have a problem, well, how do we solve it? We sit around a table and we talk about it. And then the other part that I really would like to just discuss just a little bit is the dynamic of generations, because that is a lot of the dynamism that we're seeing. And basically, one of the sticks of some of the people in the shadows is to have the generations continually fighting each other. And, that's one thing that we need to do is we need to be able to talk to our children, talk to their children. And this is what it's all about. It's about talking and solving our problems, because we need a better world for our children.
Thank you. Thank you. Paul and Liz, you have a minute or so just to talk about your basic approach to this roundtable, please.
Right. Well, our basic approach is in really focusing on the narrative creation process, which is what we really finally came to understand was the experience. And that experience started before we actually got into Afghanistan. It started with the Carter administration. It started with the end of the Vietnam War. It started with the realization that we needed to go beyond the Vietnam War into a new kind of relationship with the world. And that inaugurated the idea of advancing the peace treaties and détente, the SALT Treaty. And these are all things that were going on during the 70s. And Carter was actually elected on this basis. And what we were doing at the time was working on a documentary about the SALT Treaty. And we interviewed people like John Galbraith and Paul Warnke, who negotiated the SALT Treaty. And the Soviet Union crossed the border into Afghanistan. And the entire concept of negotiation, peace, literally died within a day. And there was nobody left in Washington who would even talk about it anymore. I think the people who were pushing for the SALT treaty literally just went into the shadows. So when the Western media was kicked out of Afghanistan, we eventually got the first visa, got in. And of course, what did we find? The story on the ground was nothing like the story that was being presented on the evening news. We did that trip for CBS, and that was our first really practical experience at the narrative creation process. What we discovered, as is usual, as we all know well now, but this is why it's important, because we witnessed the Afghanistan narrative creation process at its origin. And that's why we feel it's particularly important to understand what was going on back then. So you're not going to be surprised about what's going on now at all. In fact, it's actually, it's so advanced and so deteriorated at this point that, we feel it's really going to be, it can't go on much longer in this form, okay, the narrative, because what you're witnessing in Afghanistan today is the final outcome of what was obvious to us back then, that the level of manipulation of the actual story, which included outright misrepresentation of footage. We have wonderful stories about our experience with ABC, with CBS, with certain people who came from organizations representing the Mujahideen, who wanted to encourage us, for instance, to include a story about the Soviets using chemicals in the Afghan situation. And we explained to this person, well, there really isn't any evidence to prove it. And she said, well, New York Times and the Washington Post accepted my claim. And I said, well, if you actually showed us proof, real proof, we will consider it. She said, we don't need proof. We know that the Soviets are guilty. So this is the outright in-your-face attitude that we got. And this would have been 1982. So by the time we rounded out our experience at the end of 1987 and realized that it didn't matter how many facts we dragged in, the narrative was not going to be changed. And that's when we decided to write screenplays and ended up writing one for Oliver Stone, and discovered Hollywood was no different. It was not going to be an easier battle to get this story through Hollywood. So we just kept moving on. Well, we really got our answer about the whole process in 2007, when Charlie Wilson's War was made into a film. And today, the biggest problem we face with our story is helping people understand that Charlie Wilson's War is the propaganda story. And what we call the valediction, Three Nights of Desmond, is the antidote to Charlie Wilson's War.
Nice.
Very good.
Nice. And Dr. Nawabi, I just want to read your fuller bio before asking you to tell us how you're approaching this roundtable. You are Assistant Professor of Economics, Sociology, and International Studies at the City University of New York, Bronx Community College. Dr. Nawabi is also the co-editor of the 19th edition of the economics textbook, Real World Globalization, and his co-authored article, The Making and Unmaking of the Modern Afghan State, will be published in this coming spring in the Journal of Global South Studies. Dr. Nawabi, what would you share with us about all of the above, sir?
Well, first I want to thank Elizabeth and Paul's for inviting me and having me participate in this roundtable. And they're two phenomenal books that they have written on Afghanistan. They need to be translated in the native language of Afghanistan, which is Dari and Pashto. Eventually, they're just really insightful books. What I want to contribute is an article I wrote just recently. It's called Afghanistan, the Great Deception, which Elizabeth and Paul read, and they liked, and they said, perhaps I can sort of pick up with the content of that article, which essentially is to analyze the last 20 years of the US NATO occupation, and just take and sort of reveal the deception of from 3 point or angles, the military approach, the economic approach, and the political approach. I mean, you don't really build a country where you underpay the police force and you underpay its military, and especially when you and so that's one level. I mean, and this was not only done because the Afghan government was corrupt. The way the US and NATO funded the government itself caused these underfunding of the police force and the military, right? Then at the economic level, 80%, 75% of the country is agricultural. They completely neglect the rural areas where the large majority of the population lives at. So unemployment is 40, 50%. It forces, artificially people to move into the cities. Unemployment is, how is it that the most developed countries in the world go where 2% of the labor force is agriculture, where they've subsidized their farmers, like the US subsidized about $45 billion, $49 billion a year. The whole GDP of Afghanistan is 20 billion, the whole GDP. And that they don't know how to help Afghans have alternative agriculture for the last 20 years, and opium becomes 90% of the world's production for 20 years. You make a mistake one.
That is
you make a mistake
one major questions. Yeah.
This can't be a mistake. And at the political level, they impose someone like Hamid Karzai, who nobody knows. They pull him out like a rabbit from a hat, and then when he does bad things, then they make it seem as if Afghans have no other qualified people. And as Elizabeth and Paul will tell you, we had tens of thousands of people who were very qualified, well-educated people who could run the country, but they don't select from that. It's like if I may give you an analogy, if I have for the last 10, 12 years, the US has done everything it can to prevent Aristide from going back to Haiti. Mm-hmm. Right? They'll work with any other corrupt Haitian politician, but they will not take Haiti and Aristide and his sort of circle of managers who would run the Haitian state. Same thing they did with Afghanistan. They'll work with the Islamists. They'll work with anybody, but not the secular, more modern liberal Afghans.
Joeed, thank you. I wanted to get your, from the hip, and now invite Paul and Liz to, take a nice deep breath, because they've been living this and studying it and thinking about it and expressing it. Voices crying in the wilderness about an infamia, to use a word from the movie The Godfather, I guess, about what America has done and been doing in Afghanistan since the 1970s. So for all of us to just really settle in here now and give Paul and Liz, great, the privilege of a great listening as they, and Joeed, then the baton will be, then it's an open conversation really between the three of you, but they're going to really set the table for what they're bringing to us about what's going on, and then taking it from there. So Paul and Liz, thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you for having us, and everybody for coming today. It's a great opportunity to talk about something and that is really near and dear, not just to us, but should be to every American, especially. Afghanistan is a textbook example of, if you wanted to run a foreign policy correctly, all the things you shouldn't do have been done to Afghanistan. And you could I could give you a litany of it. We wrote a number of books about it, published before, and we got together with Kris to present this our story in a kind of different way. We've been banging away at this story, chipping away at it like a sculpture for a long, long time now. So we've met a lot of the people involved with this along the way, and they had some very interesting insights. It ranged from deeply concerned about the fate of the Afghan people, and that is something that I think we all shared as we went through this process over the last 40 years, 45 years, that people really, the more they got to know people like Joeed, the more they got to know the Afghan people, the more they understood what Afghanistan was really all about and trying to do, and had been trying to do over centuries, to try to bring itself to a different place, to overcome this medieval mentality. And that medieval mentality was encouraged by the external forces that were there during the time period. And specifically, one of those forces was the British Empire. The British Empire is in itself a fascinating story. And when you get into the history, the background of Afghanistan, which we did do, I visited the Hada Museum. It was a museum at the time. It had been a temple near Jalalabad when I was there in 1981. And I was absolutely fascinated by it because it was something I absolutely knew nothing about. This was the Greco-Hellenistic, Greco-Buddhist influence in that part of the world. And Alexander the Great he'd created cities and villages and a population in that entire part of the world. So we were, as Westerners, deeply connected to this experience before we were even Westerners, before this kind of thinking, before Greco-Hellenistic thinking even got to Britain and to Europe. It was in Afghanistan. And you can see the mix, and you could just feel the power of that place. The Bamiyan Buddhas, the whole nature of the intellectual level of the society that existed 3, 4, even 5,000 years ago in Afghanistan. And the inability to communicate the importance of that to the American people. And especially, there were some sensitive news people along the way who listened, and there were others who was just simply callous. Afghanistan was just another step in the centuries-long effort for empire to overcome and basically control nothing less than the world. So, and at the time it was viewed, the Soviet Union was viewed as our arch enemy. I always liked Curtis LeMay's comment when he was approached years ago, back in the 50s, about the Soviet Union being the enemy, and Curtis LeMay corrected his lieutenant and said, "They're not the enemy. They're just our adversary. The enemy is the Navy." And so I think he summed it up with that particular comment, because the internal bureaucratic forces that we encountered in dealing with this, it's almost like it's irrelevant who the United States was up against. And basically they were dismissed as being unimportant. And the more we got to know what was going on in Afghanistan and meet the Afghan people and what they were trying to do for their own country, that's when we became convinced that there was something deeply wrong with it. So that's what began for us in 1979, 1980. The book kind of gives you a step-by-step how we were introduced to this process. We were there. I was hired to do a public affairs program at a Christian Broadcasting Network affiliate in late fall of 1977. And I worked with them 1978, 1979 into 1980. And it was a very interesting experience for me. I was not an evangelist. I was not pro one way or the other, any particular thing. But at the time, there was a rule called the Fairness Doctrine that the United States was upholding. So you had to come in and present different points of view to the public. And the station was, needless to say, not presenting both sides of issues that were very germane to the American public. And they were airing a documentary which had been created by an ad hoc group for the defense industry called The Salt Syndrome, which basically was saying that the Soviets were preparing for a third world war. They were going to nuke us any day now, and we had to implement this enormous military budget. So I went to the station manager and I said, we got to do something about this. You can't air this 3 times a day and expect not to get the attention of the people at the FCC. So they agreed reluctantly to throw in a few bucks, and we, because of my unique position as a lifetime resident of this particular area, and also with the name of Fitzgerald, which carries, much to my surprise, that was also an education, which carried its own implications with it in the Boston area. I was able to introduce myself to some people and get some fairly high-level opinion about what was really going on between John Galbraith and Paul Warnke, who had negotiated the SALT Treaty, and they were very candid. And that was the wonderful thing about it. And that's what we wanted to do with the book, was to give you, the audience, the reader, instead of just a fact-based, pounding, boring, brick upon brick approach to this thing, present this thing as a personal experience with all the real people and all the voices that were out there at the time. And it came across, and it was almost, it got to be very exciting actually writing it. It was like talking through my own past. So.
And Paul or Liz, just flesh out a little bit what Liz had already described, maybe a little more slowly, and just with that impact of the peace movement by the late 70s was still riding from the debacle of Vietnam and the outrages of the abuses of power from the Nixon administration. And you said today that Carter came in kind of on the wave of that, and the SALT discussions the talks were tending toward disarmament. And what a revolution it was when Carter came in and things started to change with Brzezinski. And then what you, Paul, and you found into the specific kind of, I'm going to say, atrocities in Afghanistan. You want to pick it up with all that, or?
Well, I think that initially what we encountered was really realizing that whatever story we came back with in terms of, there was an already pre-existing narrative that had already been structured. That's why when the Soviets first crossed the border, the narrative was already in the system. The narrative was already in the hands of the rip and read artists.
And what was that narrative? You've described that so well.
That the Soviet Union basically was trying to take over the world. They had crossed the border into this neutral, innocent country, and it was clearly an invasion. And Carter called it the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. But we now know that President Carter had been quite aware of what Dr. Brzezinski had been doing, which was actually intentionally creating provocative circumstances in the southern republics of the Soviet Union preceding the Soviet invasion. In fact, the minute he got into the White House, Brzezinski activated his nationalities working group, which was basically the core of the meaning of that was to provoke Muslim resurrection that would stir trouble in the Soviet Union. And Afghanistan was a very convenient location to activate that in. So there was a number of issues that Brzezinski brought that had already been set up by him. And he was now in an opportune moment to make something happen that he obviously was beginning to make happen.
And what was Afghanistan like in the 70s? In a recent meeting, you told us about the percentage of women who were in the universities. What was the culture there like that Americans today have no idea?
Right. Well, we certainly, from our perspective, and I'm sure Jawed can add a lot more to that, but there's a wonderful photograph that we found just a few weeks ago that shows 3 Afghan women walking through Kabul University, at the university. And the women have a look of confidence and a look of self-empowerment that is so profound. You don't need anyone to tell you these women are more than free. They have a kind of freedom I've never just witnessed in a college kid like that.
And they had the kind of short skirts that I studied very academically. They had the mini skirts
and all of that. Yeah, but this confidence was more important, quite frankly, than just the wearing of the mini skirt. There was a kind of communication the presence that was just right there in your face, and you could feel it. And the statistic that really says it all is that in the 1970s, apparently something in the range of 60% of the students at Kabul University were women. I think that really speaks loudly that this idea that Afghanistan somehow never wanted their women educated. Yes, there are certain individuals have attitudes about that, but that was not actually the common feeling at all. And in fact, historically, and again, Jawed, I'm sure that you could add much to this, that it was well known that Afghans were always practiced a moderate form of Islam. The country was secular in its governmental structure. It was not an Islamic state. They did have a king, but eventually that was replaced by a prime minister. But the evolution of their history was definitely secular in terms of the government. but they also were very well known to being open-minded, hospitable. This goes back into the 19th century. There are documents from people visiting Afghanistan, just overwhelmed with the way they'd be greeted, with such openness and generosity. And of course, the Afghans are well known for their hospitality. In fact, I always found it kind of annoying and upsetting even when they would talk about the Taliban using the Pashtun Wali guest as the excuse. I felt it was such a denigration against the Afghan people that they would align this very real value that the Afghan people had given to the world, their whole existence, and line it up with the Taliban, who clearly, and that of course we have a lot to say about. I
want, if I could just keep this chronologically for a little while, and we're going to get to the Taliban, and we're going to get to, but what Afghanistan was before our provocations, I think funding into Pakistan. So somehow Saudi and American funds got into the hands of what became the Mujahideen, and America was told by President Reagan and the corporate media that they're freedom fighters. Those are the good guys. Talk about what the Mujahideen was really doing to the Afghanis, please.
Well, they were basically an alien force that was recruited by Pakistani intelligence. There's an old story about Pakistan. Most countries have a military. In Pakistan, the military has a country, and that's probably more so today than ever before. And so they were very, very aggressive. They were hysterical about, they had already fought the war with East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. So they were terrified about losing influence on their Western boundaries. Now that had been going on for years prior to Pakistan even existing as a state. When Pakistan was created, it was like they made numerous threats to the Afghans that they were going to come in and break them down. Okay, they were terrified of Afghan nationality. And Afghan nationality had been an issue for hundreds of years prior to that, where the rulers of Afghanistan had been building a consciousness, had been building an identity, intermarriage between Tajik and Pashtun and Hazara. There was a number of different things that they were being encouraged. And this was something that was just, given the scale of what was going on, the pressure between Russia prior to the Soviet Union and the British Empire created a boundary. Mm-hmm. It gave Afghanistan some breathing space in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so it had a policy of official neutrality. So it had the opportunity to go and start developing as a nation during that time period. And the fact is that there were always radical mullahs in the mountains, in the other part of what today is Pakistan. 2/3 of what today is Pakistan used to be Afghanistan. So, most people aren't even aware of the fact that these are all Afghan tribal homelands. And so the Pakistanis were paranoid about the fact that when Prince Dawood or the king would get up and say, it's about time that that land on the other side of the Durand line was returned to us. That gives us our connection, our needed connection in order to develop our economy and develop our society. And so the Pakistanis would immediately go to Washington and say, those communists are influencing the Dawood regime again. They're influencing the king. The leftists are going to overcome. You have to give us money. You have to give us weapons to defend against the onslaught of the communists in Afghanistan. There's a guy by the name of Dave Edwards. He wrote a book 20 years ago, around the time we came out with some of our stuff. And he basically, I think he used to be with National Geographic, and, very conservative guy. And he said basically that what the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, represented when they took over in 1978 was nothing really new. That was in a long line of progressive Afghan governments that had formed in the 19th century all the way up to 1978. It was just another step, and the people applauded it. The people of Afghanistan welcomed it, because that was their opportunity to leave this kind of gripping feudalism and backwardness that they knew was there, knew on the outside.
By the late 70s, was there kind of an equal battle between the forces in Afghanistan that wanted to modernize, they wanted to westernize, and the backward elements? Were they kind of balanced by the late 70s, and then the tablecloth got pulled out from under them by how we destabilized them through Pakistan and the Mujahideen, and then the Soviet presence as an excuse to build up our arms and ammunition by demonizing the Soviet Union as a conqueror who wants to eventually get down to, I think, the Arabian Sea or the Persian Gulf.
It's the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea.
Right.
But
Right.
you've got the port of Gwadar, okay, would traditionally have been in Pakistan, would traditionally have been under the control of Afghans.
Well,
But this
the
is what the
reason I'm interjecting, Paul, is because I want to kind of put the basic building blocks for our audience who just know maybe what the mainstream has taught us about
Right.
these things. And then so the two, Liz and Paul and Joeid could put some meat on the bones in the remaining portion of this roundtable, just in broad strokes of like our title says, the American duplicity in the 1980s, and how we exploited the Afghan people to quote unquote trap the Soviet Union there. The Soviet Union, you discovered they really, really, really wanted to get out very, very soon, very, very early.
They never wanted to go in.
We got the hard
Yeah.
evidence that they didn't want to be there and they wanted to get out.
No,
And it was a ploy all along.
it was.
And I want Paul and Liz for you to consider what kind of conversation you would have with Joeid now to leverage his expertise and presence in our inaugural roundtable.
Well, I would like to, add, from our perspective, before we get into the other side, the effect that the United States had on the Afghans is clearly in Joeid's realm. But the effect that the U.S. had on the American people is what we're focused on, okay? And that's the whole point about what we really witnessed was the total manufacturing of a completely, just a fantasy, okay? And it worked primarily probably because very few people had any direct involvement with Afghanistan. Afghanistan was really being run not directly by the United States. So you had a detached issue going on there, so that Americans clearly, when their own, Americans are directly involved, there's obviously going to be a lot more focus and analysis, but this literally was easy. And the biggest problem that we realized happened in 1975 when the United States left Vietnam. The United States was supposed to reinvest in the American infrastructure, inside America for the American people. That the Vietnam War had actually destroyed a lot of the consumer economy, and a lot of the infrastructure was really in great need of repair. What happened because of the Soviet invasion, which we now have documented 100%, was an event that never had to happen, that Afghanistan did not have to be turned into what it is currently suffering from right now. But what also happened was a complete denial of reinvestment in the United States. So in a way, the United States is suffering at levels that are equal in some ways to Afghanistan in terms of the depravity that resulted from this kind of fraud that was perpetrated by, unfortunately, President Carter when he chose to claim that this was the greatest threat to peace. And then that started the process which Reagan finished, which was the largest increase in defense spending since World War II. And it was all predicated on the Soviet Union having crossed the border. And the rumors, of course, floating around were that they were going after the Persian Gulf oil, and all kinds of moves were made by Brzezinski and Carter once they started the ball rolling. Okay, so in a way, I guess what I'm saying to Joeid is, your experience in many ways, I'm sure, it actually matches in many ways the kind of suffering that really the effect of what happened to Afghanistan has happened here too, is what I'm saying. So you can tell us from your perspective, I think.
Joeid, you are muted. You must unmute your microphone.
Oh,
Tested.
hi.
Hi.
Look, I speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Hi. Well, first of all, I mean, what Elizabeth and Paul are saying absolutely so insightful. There's so many Afghans who could learn from them. They themselves are so naive and duped, as you can say, with the U.S. narrative that even the Americans have bought. I deal with that with my own family members. Where would you like me to continue from? Would you like? I'm
Well,
sort of.
I was thinking about the perspective from Afghans who knew what was going on, but
Oh, okay. Yes.
and also the frustration I think you have with Americans who,
Yeah.
it's that whole side of the story.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Misery
Well,
at so many levels.
right. Well, I mean, what Paul and Elizabeth said, it's true that, for example, yes, Afghanistan, as Europe went through its sort of modernization process where there were conservatives who are reluctant for modernization and they push back. I mean, I remember reading years ago that in the U.S. when they imposed the public education system, a lot of conservatives in rural areas did not want their kids to go to schools because they thought that the public schools would corrupt their children and take away the Christian values. So there was always this tension between modernity and tradition, and Afghanistan was no different. But I can say one thing from what I've read in my own sort of scholarly research, that a lot of small countries such as Afghanistan or Nicaragua or Haiti, unfortunately, they get overwhelmed by external forces that really distort their domestic movements towards modernity. And the sad irony of this is that, you see, when you think of the West and how the Western conservatives always talk about their sort of Judeo-Christian or Hellenic values of rationality and modernity and science and secularity, the sad thing is that when you actually look at their foreign policy, whether it's the Dutch foreign policy, whether it's the American foreign policy or the English, they always love to work with the most reactionary, backward, religious kinds. So, for example, as Paul said, you go back to our king in Amallah Khan in 1920s. He was influenced a lot by European modernity and Turkish secularism, and he wanted to implement some of this in Afghanistan. And we had a 1923 constitution. There was modernity taking place, and yes, there was pushback. But had it not been for British support for the traditional movement, they would not have succeeded. If the domestic forces were allowed to fight it out, my own assessment is that the domestic forces of modernity would have won out against the conservative, reactionary religious forces.
Right.
And same thing in the 70s in Afghanistan. If it wasn't for the billions of dollars that the U.S. pumped prior to the Soviet invasion, that artificially funded, this started with Eisenhower, with the sort of the weaponizing Islam.
Yeah.
They used it against Nasser in Egypt. It wasn't just in Afghanistan. I mean, I see Mr. Ray McGovern there, and I know he knows a lot about these issues also. I've heard a lot of his speeches and talks throughout the years. But, they weaponized this religion to the point where they took the most extreme. It's like think about the KKK in the U.S., and you get billions of dollars of support of the most sophisticated intelligence and money, and artificially strengthening the KKK in America, and then generalizing this, saying this has always been America. So yeah, in the 80s, had the Mujahideen not been artificially supported, and even with all the support, they almost several times lost.
Good point.
I mean, they never really won in a lot of these battles that they fought with the Afghan forces and the Soviet forces. It really tells you a lot. I mean, and yes, unfortunately, the sad thing is that when you do live, as an Afghan in the U.S. or anywhere else, you do have to always constantly battle this Orientalist depiction of Afghanistan of being this sort of tribal backward country. Exactly. And there are certainly elements of that, without doubt. But they essentialize that as if that's what Afghanistan is and will never change, as if that's the essence of Afghanistan. Well, I mean, we could go back to the 1776 essence of America in a slave-owning society and then essentialize that as being America. But obviously, America in 1776 and today is very much changed and constantly changing, right? What is that saying, right? To working on the experiment of becoming a great nation, right? The U.S. is constantly improving itself. Well, the same thing with a lot of other countries, right? So what is Spain of 1930 compared to the Spain of 2022?
Yeah.
Right.
I'm watching the clock. We've got, a robust 15 minutes and more so. And I want to go around the table here and Kris, if now or before we end, do you want to open up your heart with anything in reply to this?
I want to talk a little bit, I'm a hippie, and hippies love Afghanistan, and not just from America. And, this is like, they declared a war on drugs, and, and so that means that the vice cops, are in charge, and the things that they've all talked about. I mean, it almost sounds like somebody's been planning this, problem. Okay, they've been creating this problem. Yes, Joey.
I just, since you've mentioned hippies, I just want to point two things about, just to, again, just to pick up on your point, and also to Paul and Elizabeth's point about the Afghanistan in the 70s with the woman wearing a skirt. Do you know in the 70s, Afghanistan was like the base. I have my family members who own hotels in Kabul where hippies would come on their way back to India. And Afghanistan was producing wine. We were exporting wine to Italy. Afghanistan has one of the most beautiful grapes in the world, because I mean that region is the origin of grapes, Right. And so I mean it's amazing where we've come back to where we were. We were exporting. We were competing with wine production.
Right. And what Liz and Paul have been saying. A lot of this is about trying to get to the true narrative, because we've all been just flim-flammed by all these false narratives with agendas that these people have had. And, I've done a lot of research on the drug trade, and, you can follow the American military. And, they, in Vietnam, we took over the Golden Triangle. We went to the Balkans. If you look at historically, the Balkans were always number 3 to 5 in opium production, because it's in the mountains. In the mountains, you can do what you want until somebody with a gun says, no, you better not do that. And so we have time time keeps on rolling. Okay, and we've got a paradigm shift that is happening, and it is up to us, the people, to create our own narrative and our own future. And we can do this, but it's going to take work.
What's the paradigm we're in, and what's the paradigm we're moving into, Kris?
Well, if you look at it from astrological things, we're going from, the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarian. We're also going into the great year shift of 2,600 years. And, Ken can speak about that much better than I can. But it just behooves us to listen to what people are saying and, change. Let's change this world.
Well, I'm going to change and correct an oversight at the beginning, and you just mentioned S.K. Bain, and I want to invite and challenge Kent to just from the heart respond to all of the above. My friend, go ahead, please.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm here much more as a student of the authors of The Valediction than as a participant. They have graciously put me through a crash course on Afghanistan history over the last several months, and I have thoroughly enjoyed that. And my books deal heavily with propaganda and psychological warfare, and understanding the propaganda effort that was employed in Afghanistan over the successive generations. Their meticulous dissection of that campaign has just been thoroughly fascinating. So I'm here to learn as much as to contribute, and extremely happy to be part of the roundtable today.
Well, thank you. And another paradigm shift, kind of the complement, Kris, to the, we'll call it esoteric, well documented, absolutely fascinating. We would all need many, many clones to read all there is about what Kris was talking about, the implications of this 26,000 year age transforming into another one. But there's an equal, and it's in the big framework of what this Roundtable series is, the rise and fall of empires. And Liz, you've spoken very eloquently about that from the heart. What would you say about—
And the emergence of the feminine.
Okay, okay.
Liz
Well,
Gould.
I definitely think that, we all know empires do rise and go away. My attitude about empires is I think it's been proven too many times that empires always end very badly. So I think that our chance right now, especially if this really is the great year and this is a great opportunity for transformation, is to rethink the lesson of what empire is. I certainly have a lot of opinions about that, especially having witnessed the failure of the American empire to actually show the ability to transform itself even into a more mature empire. So something happens in the imperial mind that we really have to come to understand. And I do think it is the imperial mind itself that is the problem, okay? Imperialism itself. And that's why we say we're not just talking about the end of the American empire. We are talking about the end of empire itself. But that means it's our opportunity, and that's where the new narrative comes from, and that's our whole point. That's why we finally walked away from the idea that if we got more facts, we could change their narrative. We finally realized it's not about changing they're going to die believing that narrative. It doesn't make any difference what happens. It's going to dissolve of its own internal dysfunction. But what we need to do is we need to be prepared to create a new narrative. And that's what we're doing in our books. A Valediction, 3 Nights of Desmond is definitely, I said, the antidote to Charlie Wilson's War. I think there's just too many Americans who literally think that that is kind of the whole experience of the US role. And the Valediction Resurrection is about our own idea about a new narrative coming out of that experience. And I think everybody has to do that in their own way.
And,
Can I jump in? Can I jump in as an author?
well,
I know it's
Charlotte,
just-
we kind of have a plan
No,
for
let
this,
Charlotte speak.
Charlotte talk. Yeah.
and our plan is to be flexible.
Guys, yeah, we've been in touch a lot, so I totally support what they're doing. I approach the area and the whole Middle East from a geopolitical perspective. I discovered while researching what killed my master spy father way back in the 40s. And what I ended up doing is following the pipelines, okay? There is an oil and energy dimension to this whole thing. Why all the great powers are looking at Afghanistan not as a major producer of oil, but as a major passageway for the oil to be shipped across it to Asia. And part of that whole scheme is the TAPI pipeline. I've got a map here, which shows it. And I don't know how it shows up on you, but anyway, it looks like it's backwards to me. But at any rate, that's one of the maps in my book. My book is full of maps. And once you look at those maps, it all becomes very clear.
Thank you,
Oil
Charlotte.
is the predominant commodity. And we need to look at that to analyze what's going on.
And Jawed, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, could I just react to or address Charlotte
Yeah, go ahead.
point? So I think she has a point. I mean, she started in the right direction. I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski, which Paul and Elizabeth know very well, how destructive he was. He wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, which I really advise a lot of people to read. And it's just not the pipeline; it's just the whole Central Asian area.
Excuse me, Jawed.
Yes.
Will everyone but Jawed, please mute yourselves? We're hearing background. Charlotte, maybe could you mute yourself?
Oh, no,
Thank you.
I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I had the monitor for my little baby. Okay.
It's all coming together. It's all coming
okay?
together.
I'm sorry.
Wonderful.
So could I, everything okay? I apologize.
All
So the thing is, so the Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard is really fundamental for a lot of Americans and almost everybody to read about why the U.S. really is interested in that area. It's just it's a passageway, but it's also to control the Central Euro-Asia, what Brzezinski talks about. I don't want to go into details, but it's a fundamental book if you want to talk about geopolitics or international relations, to read that book, because it is part of the grand strategy of the U.S. The U.S. does have a strategy. The PNAC is part of that strategy, and to make sure that Central Asia does not, coalition to another sort of counterbalancing power that can, challenge Western power in the world, is something they are, afraid of from that area, because it has energy, it has historical precedents of empires previously. There are three fundamental factors that can unite Central Asia: the religion of Islam, the Dari language, and so the Silk Road. So these are factors that Brzezinski talked about in his book. That
Silk Road, really important.
That the U.S. must make sure that none of these factors become a uniting factor, which then you could get into why they went to Iraq and everywhere else. But anyway.
Right.
Thank you.
And why they don't want any modern, sophisticated, educated Islamic State. They went out of their way. What the British really inaugurated that. So the British were very intent on making sure that Afghanistan did not get access to economic development, obviously, and such.
Let's open it up to questions, Bruce.
More flexibility. I see Catherine's hand. Please unmute yourself, Catherine Wilson.
Oh, Paul and Elizabeth and everybody, thank you so much for this incredible Zoom. I want, as a filmmaker,
Catherine, you've got it. Catherine, there's tremendous background clutter.
Here we go.
Thank you.
As a filmmaker for 40 years, when you were talking, Elizabeth, I was seeing like Quantum of Solace. I was seeing these films, The Tears of Allah. As a hippie, as a radical, as a feminist, and as an American Indian, dude, this is incredible. And I want to get in the solution. Yeah. I'm an old woman that's back at the U of O getting her PhD in film, and I am starting to mentor young documentary filmmakers of color this fall. This is the solution. We need the voices of all of these beautiful people, the Chinese, the Afghan people, the Black people, the Indian people. We need these voices to start telling their stories about the truth. The truth will always, always, always come out, but we all need to support these young filmmakers.
I want to pick up on that. I want to pick up on that, Catherine. Did you complete your thought? Thank you. Because it resonates with what, Liz, you were describing about empire has to end, or we need a new kind of empire.
No.
Catherine just...
No, not a new empire.
Not a new empire.
I thought you said something like that. Clearly,
no, we're talking about a new idea.
An alternative.
An alternative to imperial thinking.
Right, yeah. Which is echoing what
imperial means you need to control things.
Exactly. And it also is an excuse to basically take your neighbor's whatever.
Right.
Well, how ironic, since I'm over controlling. Ray McGovern, please unmute yourself.
Thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great.
Okay. I just compliment Catherine for building some planks here. What I'd like to do is invoke the Noah principle. No more awards for predicting rain. Awards only for building arcs. We can complain forever. I've been complaining for 20 years about not getting into the media, being, false narratives and all this stuff. Catherine has just mentioned some lumber that we can use, and I applaud her because that's what young people do. They look at films. I also think that there's a unique opportunity here, which I may not see again in my lifetime. The debacle of our leaving Afghanistan, however correct the decision was, opens up new opportunities, witnessed by the fact that on 9/11, on the front page of the New York Times, there was a major article which said, evidence indicates that claims that a ISIS operative were hit by that bomb in Kabul contradict the official story, or words to that effect.
This past September 11th.
This one, yeah, like
Thank
a week ago, yeah.
Yes, yes.
So what are they saying? That the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is lying through his teeth? Well, not only are they saying it, they showed it in videos. I don't know.
On the front page.
2 days in a row. So what I'm saying here, if the New York Times sees this opportunity to call the powers that be liars, which is exactly what they did. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of course, still insists that this is otherwise the case, proven. So what I'm saying here is that this history is incredibly important. The major task, in my view, is to find some imaginative way to get it out there, I hope everyone reads your book, but I don't think many people are gonna, unless we're more imaginative than we've been so far.
Mr. McGovern, would you get your background? Would you get your background? Tell the folks who don't know your background, sir.
Yeah, well, I was a CIA analyst for 27 years. I might add a little footnote here. I was a Russian foreign policy analyst, Soviet foreign policy. My friend Mel Goodman, who was running the division for Soviet analysis of Afghanistan, was taken completely by surprise by the Russian invasion. I asked Mel, didn't the people working for Brzezinski tell you what they were doing to incite the Russians? Didn't they prepare you to say, well, the Russians going to react? And he said, no, they didn't. That's why we were so off on this. So what I'm saying here is the intelligence community itself is bifurcated. The analysts can only do what they have access to information to do.
Right.
And when they get involved, worse still, with the operatives, I had people on the analysis part cheering the stingers. Oh, we're going to get stingers. And then inflating the number of Russian or Soviet aircraft shot down. So, you get a corrupt intelligence agency that you can't really depend on anymore. And that's what we have now. So all the more is it up to us to get the word out. And I just hope we can be more imaginative. I think that the fault may not be in the stars, but maybe in ourselves.
Wow. I'm just watching the clock. Kris, I'll go around our panelists for a consensus because it's really might be time to, no, we got the go ahead from Kris. Paul and Liz, in response to these calls for imaginative ways to get the story out.
Right. Well, I definitely appreciate what Ray is saying. And we do have a story to tell you, to all of you. Okay. We dealt with Dr. Charles Kogan about the story about Brzezinski, who in 1998 was interviewed and claimed publicly that he had drawn the Soviets into Afghanistan to get them into the Afghan trap. And that claim from 1998 on has caused a lot of problems for the institution, because there are many inside the institution that did, whether they knew it or not, they didn't want it public. That was for sure.
In what institution?
Meaning like the CIA, the bureaucracy, the State Department.
Bureaucracy.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Nobody
you.
wanted to know, but there was something else going on that even even Kogan did not understand. That Brzezinski had a stovepipe operation, and he was literally completely secret about everything he was doing. He was keeping Secretary Vance out of things, Stansfield Turner out of things. Nobody had the access to Carter he had. So this is a very special situation where when Charles Kogan told us that he absolutely didn't believe in 2009 that Brzezinski ever did that interview with the intent of claiming that he had drawn the Soviets in. We ultimately reconnected with him in 2015, where he had a chance to ask Brzezinski personally. He went up to him and he said, I never believed it, Dr. Brzezinski. And Dr. Brzezinski told Chuck Kogan, it's true. You didn't know what was going on in the White House. And he told us on camera, Chuck Hogan told us on camera he was blown away by it. And
And-
you know what, Ray? I actually think that Brzezinski did get away with a lot of secret stuff that nobody knew about. So even in the normal sense you're talking about, where there's a lot of compartmentalization, which is normal, right? This was extreme. This was far more extreme
And if
than
I could just-
anyone had ever known.
Ray,
Just a really quick one. Who is Brzezinski's deputy that helped him with all this? Well, he's a fellow who worked for me at one time in the 70s. His name was Robert Gates.
there you
Oh,
go.
yeah.
Gates.
If I could add something, please.
Charlotte,
I'm an
wait, real
author
quick.
of a-
Charlotte,
I'm-
real quick.
I'm
I
the
just,
author of
Charlotte,
a book on
Charlotte,
the Rockefellers.
Charlotte, real quick. I just want to,
David Rockefeller is the guy behind Brzezinski. You got to look at the central power faction in this country. It is still is the Rockefellers. They made their money off of oil in the 20th century. They're very sophisticated. So I am sure that David Rockefeller, with his top guy Brzezinski, came up with this scheme, and that's why it's secretive, because the boys on the top don't always tell. And here's this book, Thy Will Be Done,
thank you,
about
Charlotte.
Nelson Rockefeller's empire building in Latin America. If you read this book, you'll
Charlotte?
understand how it spreads through the world.
Thank you so much. I am catching when people raise their hand, Charlotte, and I was trying to speak over you to make that point to folks who couldn't imagine, well, who was Brzezinski and how could this man single-handedly steer foreign policy? Not everyone here on the top of their head knows he was President Carter's national security advisor. And that kind of context is most important, because we're at a time right now where maybe we in the panel want to galvanize our kind of closing thoughts and inspiration for beyond the next 3 roundtables over the next 3 months, but also what all of us, along the lines of what we found from Ray and from Paul and Liz, about what can we do, what kind of arcs can we build, how can we spread the word, and I'll bring it to you, Jawid, and we'll go then to Paul and Liz, and we'll let Kris have the last word, perhaps.
Okay, thank you. Well, since Paul and Liz wrote the book, The Valediction, in response to Charlie Wilson's War, which I remember when it came out, we shared our thoughts and we were very frustrated. Maybe perhaps somebody who is in the media, or Catherine Wilson, maybe they can read the book and then make a movie out of it. That would be great, in order to sort of combat that sort of low reading and maybe more visual population we have. That's certainly one thing I would suggest. Other than that, there's just one other point I just want to say, that we should obviously read I can't wait till I read it myself. I know that it's going to come out this month, so but I've sort of looked at some of the summary of it. I can't wait till it, because it really will set the record straight, as the other 2 books previous to this valediction have really set the record straight. And now, as much as I know we are 24 people here, but I'm pretty sure we all know others. So I would really encourage all of us to get the word out about their book and the commitment and sweat and tears that they've put for decades on Afghanistan to make Americans more aware of what's happening in their name, the criminality that's taken place in their name.
And I'll insert my final word before Paul and Liz, and it's because you just made the point, Jawid. I'm looking at all the thumbnails and of everyone attending here. There's a couple authors who are listening, who have written books. This conversation should be on the nightly news. Now, the fact that Kris, TrineDay, and we have to do this on Zoom, this is us. This is grassroots. This is reality, and it shines light on how, in my estimation, phony, mainstream, official, quote unquote, reality is across the board, not just politics, not just military operations, comprehensively. And you could go to TrineDay.com and you can get your hands on Kris's up to 120 books. You could listen to the podcast, The Journey. There's about 50 episodes there. Each is about a half hour long. And it is a comprehensive curriculum along the lines of this dive into reality. Congratulations, all of us here. We jumped the fence or we snuck backstage and we're talking about what's really going on by the forces that have trillions of dollars to fool us with what they present, who they hire, and very talented people who write really amazing scripts and look great on camera. So if it's to be, it's up to we, and that's the history of mankind. If that's a fault in our stars, Ray, then one of our assets is those who will agitate, who get no sleep until they write and publish books and make films and do all that we can to tell the truth. Yes, Liz and Paul, it is your turn.
We have a hand up that we want
We
to
have a couple of
acknowledge.
hand ups. We have Ruth and we have Matt. And we'd like to hear.
In the spirit of flexibility.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I have something that's very quick, and what I'm not a political wonk, but I am understanding how profound it is to really understand story and the source of the narrative of story, and to really understand the function of the mind to create reality through its storytelling capacity. And what's been going on is we've been swallowing stories that have been fed to us, and they have been there to manipulate us. And what I'm hearing from this discussion, it would behoove us to really understand the roots of those stories and the roots of that manipulation, so that we can respond with a story that completely illuminates a whole other reality. And that's what I'm getting from this whole discussion.
Thank you very much.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And
well-
Can we hear
Yeah.
from Matt too?
Oh, Matt is. Did,
Yeah, Matt's got his hand.
oh, okay. We
Hi.
got one more. We got one more.
Yeah, just to be quick, and I'm very much looking forward to the next session that we have in a month's time, and I'm going to certainly do my best to get my network to take part in this. I guess just to throw out there, in gratitude, having read through your manuscript and really having my eyes opened in so many ways, I felt myself that I was very informed on the details of what was behind the scenes surrounding the Afghan situation, the Soviet Zbigniew. And I realized just how many blind spots I had. So I wanted to just thank you for that. And up until now, I had really presumed that, it really was a Soviet Vietnam War situation. I had sort of believed that, even though I knew that Zbigniew had manipulated the situation behind the scenes.
Right.
And what you guys get across is that the narrative that we've been following in our current age around what's going on in Syria, the Middle East today, it's the same uncreative narrative that they took literally from word for word almost from the 1980s, where they were blaming the Soviets for using chemical weapons on the people of Afghanistan, literally, to just brainwash the Western audience. So that was just incredible. And the second thing I just want to say, maybe next month, what blew my mind was the relationship of the Trotskyites that went through a transformation under people like Albert Wolfsetter and James Burnham, and created the neocon movement. I'm not going to say any more than that.
You're going to pay for the next hour, Matt.
Yeah, okay. All right. So just thank you.
Mining
Thank
up
you.
rich
Thank you.
gold
Thank
here.
you. Thank
All
you,
right.
Matt.
All right.
Well, Liz, who's next?
I have one thing to say about that Matt just pointed out is that Wolfstetter was also a tutor of guess who? Zalmay Khalilzad, the guy who's been running Afghan policy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
Under a number of different administrations, it comes right from the core source, right from the reactor.
Yeah, I think that my feeling about what we have experienced over the last, 40 over 40 years now, is that we finally worked it to a point where we really began to understand that it really isn't about their narrative at all. I think that's the real power. The power comes from knowing that you're putting the narrative together. We're rebuilding the future by creating the story in our own mind, right. but it's like junk food. I mean, how many people have to eat junk food to get the point? Well, their narrative is junk. It's junk food for food for thought. So when you get nourishing food for thought, which we think is it isn't that you can't choose what facts you want and manipulate them in many ways to create a good story, but you understand the point at which you really corrupt what you're working with. Your facts are like a recipe. You've got all these ingredients. You can do any number of things with those ingredients. You can turn it inside out if you want to. But
That's good.
there's some level where you have to stay true to the core, okay, of the food having nutrients, of the purpose of putting it all together in some form, okay?
And that's
So
what-
that's the narrative.
And that's what
beautiful.
community is
Beautiful.
for. You're reminding me of the value of the public house, the pubs. It's where, yeah, we could all spin different stories about what happened today, but if you exaggerate too much, you're going to get beat up, if not thrown out, because
Right.
we've
Yeah.
got to
There's a
be true to a
point.
core of
There's
it.
a point, exactly, but that's the flexibility of the narrative, that it isn't just one story. That's
And we
the
have to
point.
hear, well, we also have to hear everybody's point of view, which was Catherine's point about all the voices, which the different voices who need to be heard. And it reminded me of what you said in our planning meeting, and everybody should hear the commercial that I posted for this meeting yesterday called Afghanistan, Setting the Table, where Liz makes a great point about force is killing us in terms of imposing it upon others. Now, Paul and Liz, is there anyone else you would like to have a final word before we pass the baton to Kris Millegan?
I think we've let everybody have their say. Thank you, Bruce.
Well,
thank No thank yous yet. Wait, Kris.
Okay, so a little bit, Ray. My daddy was an analyst for the CIA. He was actually with COI and then OSS, and he was with CIA when they began. And he was branch chief head of all of East Asia Analysis Office. Okay, and he started talking to me in the late '60s with telling me about another false narrative. Basically, he told me they're playing out a lose scenario in Vietnam. Okay, and he was absolutely correct, and it was basically send American boys and girls and Canadian boys and girls, New Zealand boys and girls, and Australian boys and girls to hell for 1 year. Okay, and everybody knew that after 1 year you got to go back home. And a bunch of those kids got addicted to the heroin that was being proffered to them there and went home to create a drug culture. Okay. And so there's been a lot of manipulation by what I call people in the shadows. And there's not just bad people in the shadows. There are some good people in the shadows too. But there has been a very much directed effort using very sophisticated psychological warfare techniques to get us into the position that we are now. Okay. And so I'm when I started doing this, I was thinking, okay, I can, get a book out there about Skull and Bones and, get these 800-pound gorillas out there and things will change. Well, what I found out was no. And I said, well, maybe I got to get a couple of 800-pound gorillas out there jumping up and down. Well, finally, when I got Paul and Liz's book, I said, here is a book that is looking at change, is looking at changing the narrative. And so I says, let's do it. So we're doing it. Onwards.
Great. Well, that's his wrap-up word, but I'm going to insist on a postscript. Kris, if you wouldn't mind fleshing out the return of the goddess and the other books that inspired you to create a series, a roundtable series.
Well, there's Catherine's book. There's Ed Dodge's book about the return of the goddess. And then there's just the continual books that have come to me that they're all pointing towards the same thing, that there's a paradigm shift happening. And, if we take the effort here, we have the opportunity to create a better world for our children. And we have to do it. I mean, it's just something that we have to do. And tell your friends, tell your neighbors or whatever. Now, one last thing about the generations. Now, there was a very good book called Generations, A History of America's Future. And in that, they talk about there's these 4 generations that go through history together and help each other and help us move towards a future. And you have an adaptive, an idealistic, a reactive, and a civics generation. The adaptive is also known as the artist generation. The idealistic is the prophet. The reactive as the nomad. The civic as the hero generation. The boomers were the idealistic profit generation. Okay. And so basically what generation says is that the boomers are going to get old and get didactical and just take their hand and go like this to the desktop and knock everything off the desktop. Well, I don't know if that particular is going to happen, but I do have very good hope that we can do something here, all of us together. I mean, we have an internet. We have the pictures of our planet from outer space. We know that we all live on one globe. We're all one people. And, you know, it behooves us to leave this world here as a better place. And our children need a better future than what the powers that be want to leave them.
And the way to do that is to become people who can stand up for the truth. And you've been publishing, you know, suppressed information, books that the mainstream won't touch, just because it's evidence. You know, you don't claim to be flawless and perfect in every book that you put out there, but you're marshaling a case that counters the case made by the mainstream. And I like the metaphor, I'm in the jury. I want to see the government's case that this, that, or the other thing is true. But I want to see what all your authors say, Kris, that contradict it. And I want to see both sides contest each other with cross-examination. And then I want the respect to make up my own mind and talk to my peers, because then all of a sudden I'll feel like the kind of people that the Constitution was written to and for. And suddenly the idea of inalienable rights kind of, you know, becomes kind of burning and real. Ed Dodge, did you wave your hand when you turned on your video, or did you just wave to say hi? You're muted.
I was just basically waving to say hi since I heard my name mentioned. I figured I'd turn on my camera.
Well, that gives you 60 seconds or so to talk about your book, please, and what brought you to TrineDay and brought you to this roundtable.
Oh, well, you know, I saw the invite for the roundtable late, so I came to it late. But yeah, I got introduced to TrineDay by Kris Bennett, who wrote some cannabis books that Kris published. And so my book, Lost Goddess, it's called History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. And it's an exploration
of the goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible.
Right. Sorry if I'm talking too fast.
As your public speaking coach.
Sorry. Yeah, so it's about the goddesses of the Bible, Asherah, Astarte, and the rest of the goddesses that are really badass, but we don't talk about them anymore because it was the wife of God. And so they had to kick her ass out in order to establish monotheism. But, you know, they're being rediscovered. I'm also launching a new project. I'm turning it into like a graphic novel storytelling project. I'm trying to recruit some help. So I've got a new website, lostgoddess.io. I just put it up this week. So I'm trying to recruit some people to help me turn this up into some graphic novels.
Thank you very much, Edward. And Kris, back to you for any real last word.
Onwards.
All right, folks. Thank you so much for attending, and look for, you know, please follow, you know, TrineDay on Facebook. Obviously, a lot of us, you do. And just accept the commission that you hear right now. You know, if it's meant to be, it's up to we. And just to start these conversations and then walk away if people get staticky. Hey, have you ever seen the evidence that this, that, and the other thing might be a total lie? And if they give you static, just say, well, you know, isn't the sky blue? And you walk on. But if someone's willing to listen, have a conversation that might really awake them up to an exciting field of study, if not some rousing some power in them to want to make a difference. All right. As Kris says, onwards.
Onward.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone, for coming.